Thank you very much. I'm honored to be invited by Shivaji University and the Russian State University for the Humanities to this seminar on the contemporary dynamics of South Asia. I would like to especially thank my friends Jatin Desai for inviting me and Megha Pansari as well as Arundhati Pawar. Thank you so much for your patience and for the invitation. I say thank you so much for your patience because I realized that some of you wanted me also to do perhaps a little bit of music and speak on the youth movement in Pakistan. And it's just that my schedule has been so busy over the last week, 2 weeks, in fact, that I haven't been able to honor your request, but I hope to be able to do that in the future. So my apologies this time around. I felt that it was very important to talk about a phenomena that is on the rise in Pakistan, which has not really been addressed in the scholarly community. And although we see a lot of articles about it in the context of the media and journalism and so on, but there hasn't really been a very sustained engagement with the rise of Barelvi radicalism in the context of Pakistan in the recent past. Let me begin in the 1980s. The government at that time was a military dictatorship committed to the Islamization of society. Music was frowned upon. Women would be asked to not only cover their heads, but increasingly also to cover their faces. The public was being asked more and more to display public signs of religiosity. Alcohol consumption was strictly banned. Dance parties were thought of as an invasion of Western culture. Even the mere mingling of the sexes was considered a grave offense against religion. All this was officially sanctioned by the state. And then on PTV, a young woman from Sindh, whose hair was cut very short, who did not cover her head with a chadar, whose body language was unconstrained by the conventions of the times, burst upon the airwaves like a storm breaking through all natural and man-made barriers. I'm referring to Abida Parveen and her performance of Meri Yaar Di Ghadoli on PTV. You cannot imagine how it electrified Pakistani intellectuals, especially those of a democratic and progressive persuasion. Everything that the state was repressing seemed to be embodied in this young woman's performance of this Sufi classic, and it was irrepressible. In that instance, most of the modernist, liberal, and progressive intellectuals of Pakistan fell in love with Sufism as the expression of a secular, syncretic, tolerant, humanistic, and pluralistic movement within Islam. The historical precedent seemed to be well established, extremely well established. For generations, those who had sought to escape the oppressive grip of a puritanical form of Islam had always taken refuge in the doctrines of Sufism. The romance lasted for 4 decades. Whether it was the enlightened moderation of General Pervez Musharraf or the liberal populism of the Pakistan People's Party, the message was the marriage of the modernizing elite and Sufi Islam. This was a torrid affair. This was a love marriage. But as with all torrid affairs, everything has its limits. And this marriage is also ending in a messy and nasty divorce. Let us move away from the metaphors of love. The painful facts are that Sufism, which was to serve the role of de-radicalization of society, has itself been radicalized by society. The historical precedents were present, but we ignored them. They were ignored because the movement was confronted by opponents that were not more numerous, but certainly much more powerful and influential. There was not just the implacable opposition of mysticism to logic and rationality, which any philosopher can tell you with respect to Sufism, There was not just the denial of the materiality of the world. There was not just the fact that Sufism also played a role as the social managers of landed property, but there was also its own sectarianism and tendencies towards takfir, its own hierarchy of clerics, gaddi and sajda nasheens. But we simply could not see it. वो उर्दू में कहते हैं ना, डूबते को तिनके का सहारा. हमारा भी कुछ ऐसा ही हाल था. Ahmad Raza Barelvi's declarations of regarding the Ahle Tashi, Ahmadis, Wahhabis, and Deobandis as kafirs were present for all to read, but we were far too absorbed in the present. The elevation of the Prophet to divine status was plain for all to see, but we thought of it and accepted it as a poetry of love. The connections of the Peers and their shrine keepers to the landed structure of Punjab and Sindh was well known. It was well known, but we repackaged it as folk wisdom. In the period of General Musharraf, the state, after joining forces with the US against terrorism, institutionalized Sufi Islam in the form of the National Council for the Promotion of Sufism, which was established in 2006 under the leadership of the grandson of Allama Iqbal, Yusuf Salahuddin. The People's Party similarly strengthened the culture of Urs throughout the country as a counterweight to Deobandi Islam. And as with political forces, corporate forces also got into the act, and we saw the emergence of Coke Studio with the slogan, "The Sound of the Nation." The Sunni Ittihad Council that grew out of this particular conjunction of historical forces threw its weight behind the anti-terrorism efforts of the government. Sarfaraz Ahmad Naimi organized huge demonstrations against the Taliban. He declared, quote, "The military must eliminate the Taliban once and for all, otherwise they will capture the entire country, which would be a big catastrophe," unquote. He passed a fatwa denouncing suicide bombings. He said that the Taliban leader Sufi Muhammad should, and I quote, "wear bangles if he is hiding like a woman," unquote. Forgive the toxic masculinity here, but this was considered an enormous insult. He said, and I quote, "Those who commit suicide attacks for attaining paradise will go to hell as they kill many innocent people," unquote. Naimi was also the driving force behind the Tahaffuze Namuse Risalat Mahaz, which is a big word, but what it means is this is a front for the sanctity of the Holy Prophet. This was a group of over 20 Sunni parties raising their voice against violence committed by the Taliban. On 12 June 2009, the Taliban sent a clean-shaven 18-year-old young man to blow himself up and to kill Sarfaraz Naimi. His funeral was accompanied by many chants and slogans against the Taliban. But with Naimi gone, the militant anti-Taliban leadership of the Barelvi movement was beheaded. In 2010, the Sunni Ittihad Council, which was an alliance of 8 Sunni Barelvi organizations, launched the Save Pakistan movement against the Taliban. The Taliban continue to attack the leadership of the Barelvi organizations, especially with suicide bombings. And not only that, they also attacked shrines and religious festivals. Wherever there was an Urs held, those were also security risks, and there were many suicide bombings against the Barelvis. Bloodied and bruised, the Barelvis changed gears. Out of the rubble and the beheading of the old guard stepped forward a new leadership that had supposedly, quote unquote, learned the lessons of confronting the TTP and the Deobandi lobby. To win support, they now felt they needed a different strategy. Instead of attacking the Taliban, they reversed course and began to attack the government. They saw that they could gain more sympathy especially by attacking the liberals, secular forces, and the modernists on the question of the finality of the prophet. And this would be a better path to outflank and out-radicalize the Deobandi radicals. In 2011, but the Barelvi ulema turned against the secular governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer. They attacked the governor for attempting to intercede on behalf of Asia Bibi, who was wrongly, in our opinion, accused of blasphemy. And also Salman Taseer was criticizing Article 295C, which are the blasphemy laws. The campaign against Salman Taseer reached a fever pitch until he was shot down by his own police bodyguard. His assassin, Mumtaz Qadri, was lionized by Khadim Hussain Rizvi, who went on to form the Tehreek-e-Labbaik party in 2015. In 2017, the TLP campaigned against the law minister, Zahid Hamid, over the fact that the anti-Ahmadi declaration in the electoral oath was changed from, and just a small wording was changed. And the change was that originally the wording was, I solemnly swear. And now the new wording was, I believe. And then the text was the same, which is that the Ahmadis are essentially non-Muslims. Nothing else in the text had changed, except the fact that instead of the words, I solemnly swear, the new words were, I believe. A very minor change, which makes no difference with respect to the legal standing of that particular clause. And yet the TLP went into high gear saying that this was an attempt to reverse the declaration, the constitutional declaration that made Ahmadis non-Muslims in Pakistan. They undertook a campaign and started a sit-in at Faizabad. The state and the government capitulated almost immediately. The only person perhaps in the state and in the government to have resisted was Justice Faiz Isa, who declared in his landmark ruling that the Faizabad protest was an act of terrorism. But sadly, that particular justice, that is Justice Faiz Isa, is now facing trumped up charges on corruption. Those are totally false and totally wrong and declared so by the Supreme Court. But he himself had to face the repression from within the government and state. The interior minister of the time, Ehsan Iqbal, was shot. There was an attempted assassination against him while he was addressing a public rally. He was shot in the shoulder. Luckily, the assassin could not fire a second shot. The crowd overwhelmed him, and he narrowly escaped with his life. The public, it is sad to say, has richly rewarded the TLP for changing its focus from the Taliban to the Ahmadis and to the protection of blasphemy laws. You cannot imagine how much popular sympathy they have gained as a result of changing their focus of attention away from the Taliban and towards the Ahmadis and against people who are considered to be liberal and secular. The complete inability of the government to control or even to present a cogent counter-narrative to Barelvi radicalization has meant that the TLP may have already emerged as the third largest vote-getting party in the country. This is a huge, huge shift in Pakistani politics as we know it. And we're still trying to grapple with it and understand it. The result of this is epitomized in what happened recently, when a Sri Lankan manager working in Sialkot took down posters that were within the walls of the factory of the TLP, that were put up within the factory. He took them down so that the place would look clean before an inspection and before some guests were visiting. And the workers themselves lynched this manager. His body then was burnt by a furious mob out in the streets. Now, you may ask, is it unfair of me to say that the romance with the Barelvi Sufis as a peaceful, progressive, tolerant, pluralistic, secular, syncretic force is or must come to an end? In the context of a radicalizing society, and by radicalizing, I'm using that in the negative context. In the context of an overall radicalizing society, is it possible for any religious sect, even a Sufi Barelvi sect, steeped in centuries of mysticism or metaphysical thought, to evade, escape, or oppose radicalization? Is it possible for us who continue to aspire to a democratic, secular, pluralist society to rely on such forces in order to win the battle for secularism? Where the public has been brought up on a steady diet of religiosity at the expense of secular and democratic values, I ask you, is it not inevitable that the public too will reward those political forces that march to the beat of the times? Some may object and argue that Sufism as a doctrine is not to blame for the actions of the TLP, and that there is still hope to create a tolerant and free society from within the framework of Sufi Barelvi Islam. I too, of course, have sung songs and continue to sing songs that are steeped in the Sufi tradition. I think most of the audience may already know this. So while the jury remains out on that particular question, I must state that doctrines themselves make no history. Doctrines take no actions. Doctrines have no consciousness. They have no individuality, agency, or understanding of historical forces. Doctrines are not people. It is not doctrines that make history, but people who make history. And people as a whole couldn't care less for the internal contradictions of their actions in relation to their doctrines, or their doctrines, or the contradictions within the doctrines within themselves. The competitive struggle between different sects of Islam to capture the increasing radicalized populace is sadly driving Pakistani society towards a religious sectarianism of dangerous proportions. And although I would like to end this short submission by stating that the newly growing progressive students movement in Pakistan will overcome, I am forced to end with the cliche that the optimism of my will is unable to overcome the pessimism of my intellect, at least for the moment. Thank you so much. Be happy to take your questions, comments, and criticisms.
Thank you, Mr. Rahman, for your factual account of the extremism in Pakistan and the anxiety of the secular and progressive minds. Let us hope that the progressive movement will give more hope to the conditions in Pakistan. Any questions, or should we move on, Megha?
I think Jatin will tell us how to lead.
Megha, I think you can decide, but surely I think that everyone would like to know from Taimur, because he's right now is at the forefront of the movement of students and youth. He goes to villages and sings songs, and for the first time, even in some villages in Sindh, they got tremendous response, and for the first time also, his party comrade is elected as a mayor. So I think that if we can for about 5 minutes, if Taimur can say about students movement and what kind of feedback he's getting when he's moving around in villages and other cities.
Thank you very much, Jatin. That's why I sort of left this open, because I thought you would be interested in this aspect of Pakistan. I think while it is true that there has been there are, let's say, grounds for cautious optimism for the reasons that you have described. The student movement is very, very active, and there are a lot of young people today, thousands of them, I would say, who are very interested in progressive politics. It was not the case when I came back to Pakistan after my studies and I joined the left in Pakistan. At that time, there was no, at that time, this was fresh into the breakup of the Soviet Union and the dismemberment of the left. And although the organized left was still relatively intact in the 1990s, but in the rest of society, people had moved away from any interest in leftist discourse, etc., or ideas. That is no longer the case, thanks mainly to social media. Social media has played a very important role in recreating an enormous interest amongst thousands of Twitter and Facebook users within the left. That can be seen, if you join the pages that Pakistani young people visit. They are very large pages. They are very big followings. Lots of things are being shared. There are several key things that we can talk about. One of which you have mentioned, of course, the victory of Salar Fayaz Ali of the Mazdoor Kisan Party in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is a very, very big thing. The other big thing is the rise of the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, where thousands of young Pashtuns follow people like Manzoor Pashtun, and then there's the formation of the Pakistan Democratic Movement, which is again an outgrowth of Pashtun Tahaffuz movement. So there is that. Within Sindh also, I think it's fair to say I've received a very good response there. But it is fair to say that Sindh continues to hold on to those secular pluralistic values. And I have enormous hope that, from Sindhi progressive intellectuals, maybe it's misplaced, but I really do feel that that is really still a bastion of progressive thought within Pakistan. So there are also other things that I can talk about within the peasantry. Part of the reason why we have been receiving such a fantastic response, singing in villages, etc., is I think has to do with the fact that we've just also been becoming better musicians over time. So we're performing much better than we were before. We're communicating much better than we were before. And you're right to point out that it is still a very large constituency of people who want to talk about class politics, who want to talk about the rights of poor people, and want to talk about what is in this whole framework for us in terms of the real choices in life about healthcare and education and jobs and our everyday economic and political problems. So that exists, and that is room for cautious optimism. But it is pitted against these glimmers of hope, these sort of light at the end of the tunnel. You have to remember has still not reached the scale where it can impact national politics. Because what we are talking about when we look at the other side, the right-wing conservative side, we are talking about people in the millions on that side. Recently, for example, in the elections before last, the TLP polled 2.2 million votes. The whole of the left in Pakistan cannot get together and poll even 100,000 votes. Salar Fayaz Ali polled 14,500 odd votes. All the left, if it gets together, I guarantee we cannot probably cross 20, 30,000, 40,000 maybe votes. So the scale at which the right is operating is a very different scale from the scale at which we are operating. But we are growing, and we are optimistic, and we're not giving up, and we will continue to fight the good fight. And I think some forces are beyond the control of individual efforts. Some forces are created or destroyed or move in accordance with larger historical factors. In the end, I think we are also seeing, and the last thing I would say is that in the end, we are also seeing that these right-wing forces, whether we are talking about conservative right-wing forces like Imran Khan, PTI, etc., or we are talking about far-right forces like the Taliban, the TTP, the TTA, or the TLP, or other such forces. They cannot solve the fundamental problems of the people. And the more they are unable to solve the fundamental problems of the people, the more they resort to absurdities and extremist measures that force people to the conclusion that these people do not have the solution to our problems. And that, I think, is probably the contradiction that can once again move Pakistani society towards a progressive future and all that. Thank you.